Good afternoon. I'm Bill Hammond. I'm CEO of the Texas Association of Business and a proud partner working with Jamie and all the great folks at AHIP. Today we have 3 contestants. They will be judged on brevity and pithiness. So keep your scorecards handy. We'll be voting at the end of the presentations. But seriously, we're joined by 3 excellent panelists. Mara Osman is the Southeast Regional Director for AHIP and has 20 years of experience working with state and local leaders to educate decision makers and public about diverse policy issues. At AHIP, she advances the association's interest on state legislative and regulatory, healthcare, and insurance matters in 10 states. That's a heck of a sentence. Prior to joining AHIP, she was with Milliman Care Guidelines, where she led government and quality agency relations for the company that produces evidence-based medical guidelines and interactive clinical decision support tools. We're also joined by John Rother. John is the President and CEO of the National Coalition on Healthcare, America's oldest and most diverse group working to achieve comprehensive health system change. Prior to joining the coalition, he served as the ED of the Vice President of Policy for AHIP, where he led the development of AHIP's policies and advocacy strategies. And finally, Ruth Opdycke, who is the Director of Specialty Pharmacy Strategy for Cigna, and in that role is responsible for leading Cigna's approach to align incentives and engagement with both internal and external key stakeholders as it relates to the rapidly expanding area of specialty pharmaceuticals. That's a job and a half. Ruth has extensive career history of leadership roles in various companies focused on pharmaceuticals across the healthcare spectrum, including TPG, Healthcare Consulting, Pfizer, Polypharm, and Value RX. And what's going to happen is each one of these fine individuals is going to offer a slideshow, after which we will have a Q&A.
Thank you, Bill, and thanks to TAP for the opportunity to join you here today. The topic of this panel on high-cost drugs has certainly become very high profile in the past few years, with it impacting consumers, employers, and government programs like Medicare and Medicaid. As a national trade association representing the health insurance industry, AHIP sees this as a priority issue because it impacts the unsustainable costs of high-cost drugs, impacts the affordability of healthcare coverage. We've been part of the national dialogue across the country, exploring solutions and looking at the dynamics in the industry here, and I'm going to share some of that information with you here in the next 10 minutes or so. So jumping right in with this next graphic. The Alterum Institute graphic shows national health spending growth across several areas like hospitals, dental care, pharmacy costs, and it looks at how different costs are pacing, and you see that the costs in high-cost drugs are far outpacing the cost increases in other areas of the healthcare sector. The Wall Street Journal last year cited a healthcare executive who called pharmacy costs a tsunami and identified it as one of the single biggest drivers of medical inflation in the past few years. From 2013 to 2014, it increased at the fastest rate in over a decade, jumping 13%, or over $370 billion. Last year, total prescription drug spending increased at the fastest rate and hit the highest point ever. These price increases that we're seeing are happening across generics, brands, and specialties. Generics represent about 85% of all prescriptions and about 27% of the costs. Brand drugs represent about 14% of all prescriptions and about 32% of the costs. Specialty drugs represent about 1% of all prescriptions, but over 40% of the costs. And we're seeing cross increases since 2008 on 400 generics, increases of over 1,000%. And 3,500 generics have more than doubled in price in the same time period. In a one-year time period, from 2013 to 2014, specialty drug prices increased by over 30%. The average price for a specialty drug in 2013 was $53,000, and that was just slightly more than the average median household income that year. This area of specialty drugs is most concerning. These drugs can often cost for a treatment over $100,000 a year. And there's more pressure looming on the healthcare system with over 700 specialty drugs in the development price line. By 2020, we're expecting to see spending on specialty drugs to represent 50% of all spending on prescription drugs, up from 25% in 2013. And we expect to see the dollars more than quadruple, from $87 billion in 2013 to almost $400 billion in 2020. Now, specialty drugs were the first to garner attention and grab headlines for their huge price tags, and that happened in 2013 when Sovaldi came to market as a curative therapy for hepatitis C. It came to market and was priced at $84,000. And it wasn't an isolated incident. As you'll see on this chart here, there's 7 drugs, and it shows how their price tags inflated inexplicably from 150 to 4,500% in just 7 years. And it's not a typo that you're seeing on the first line. One drug in 1 year increased in price by over 9,000%. You'll also see here with these examples that the cost dynamic is not limited to new specialty drugs coming to market. These drugs have been on the market for 7 years or longer. Last year, the Wall Street Journal looked at this dynamic of steady annual price increases on older drugs. It looked at 30 drugs and found that the wholesale price increases averaged 76% in a 5-year period. And that was 8 times the rate of general inflation. Daraprim is the most recent drug, or was the very next drug really, to grab the headlines and grab media attention. It kind of became the poster pill or poster child for exorbitant pharmaceutical pricing. That was the drug that came to market originally in 1953 to treat malaria, and now it's used more to treat parasitic infections. It had been priced at $18 a pill, and it was a 100-pill treatment. Well, the drug had been on the market for over 60 years, so its patent exclusivity had long since expired, but no generic was ever made. A new company acquired the rights to sell Daraprim in the US and jacked up the price from $18 a pill to $750 a pill. So now the treatment went from being $1,800 to $75,000. Mind you, the cost for one pill in the US, in Great Britain and in India is still under $1. And that's not the only drug where Americans face inflated price tags compared to folks abroad. Gleevec in New Zealand costs about $1,000, but it costs us 6 times that at $6,200. In England, they pay about $900 for Copaxone for MS, but here we pay 350 times more than that at $4,000. And in the Netherlands, they pay about $23 for acid reflux drug Nexium, but here we pay $215. So what's driving these costs? Lots of studies and reports have been looking at the pricing dynamics in this area, and I'm going to name 7 of them. The first, we've already talked about. It's those steady annual price increases on older existing drugs. The next is product hopping, and this is where manufacturers prolong drug patents to avoid competition from generics. In New York, the Attorney General won a case and forced a pharmaceutical company to keep making its first version of a drug, which was a 2-pill-a-day dose. The company had stopped making that version and had instead made a more expensive 1-pill-a-day dose. Well, if the AG had not won that case, it would have cost the Medicare Part D program over $280 million in 2015 alone. Evergreening is another similar dynamic where manufacturers extend the patent exclusivity of their drugs by tweaking the chemical composition or the delivery mechanism, like an extended release version. Pay to delay is another dynamic where generic drug makers are paid to keep their lower cost versions out of the market. The Federal Trade Commission has called this anti-competitive, and the Congressional Budget Office has said that if you ban those types of industry agreements, it would save over about $3.7 billion in 10 years. Biosimilar balking is a similar tactic, which delays the introduction of less costly biosimilar versions of the more high-cost biologic drugs. And of course, then there's the acquisition of drug rights, which is what we saw with Daraprim, when a specific drug has its rights acquired because it's seen as undervalued, and then the new owner comes in and jacks up the prices. Now, in trying to understand all these pricing dynamics, one factor that's often raised is research and development. But curiously, over the past 20 years, leading drug companies have earned more than 70% of their sales revenue from products that they did not develop. Reinvestment by drug companies in R&D is a fantastic concept, but data is showing that in practice it's not happening. The graphic on this slide has some data from the BBC that shows that the top pharma companies spend less than 10% of their total revenue on R&D, and they spend far more on marketing. Other reports show the similar bottom line. There's some data out there that shows that for every dollar spent on R&D, $19 are spent on marketing. And regarding the price of Sovaldi, with the $84,000 price tag, an 18-month Senate investigation into the pricing of Sovaldi concluded that there was no concrete evidence that R&D costs factored at all into how the manufacturer set its price. There's been a strong reaction to this issue from the public and from policymakers. A Kaiser Family Foundation poll found that consumers are identifying prescription drug costs as their #1 healthcare priority. 77% of Americans identify prescription drug costs as unreasonable, and that's up from 72% in the same poll last year. Policymakers at the federal and state level have really started to engage on this issue, and while John is going to speak to activity at the federal level, I'll just wrap up with giving you an overview of some of the activity at the state level. Now, in crafting solutions here, we're looking at innovation, transparency, and competition. We want to preserve innovation. We want more transparency to better understand drug pricing and development. And we want there to be a competitive market so that purchasers, whether they're state plans, whether they're pharmacy benefit managers, or whether they're commercial plans, have the ability to better negotiate prices and provide affordable access for Americans to the medications that they need. 6 states in 2015 introduced legislation to deal with this issue. All of them mostly had to do with transparency. This year, 17 states considered measures, and here's 2 examples. In Virginia, they passed budget language that directed state agencies to look at how they're spending money on high-cost drugs for the populations they serve, and then to develop recommendations about how to improve cost efficiency and effectiveness as a purchaser for the state. In Vermont, they passed legislation requiring regulators to identify 15 drugs across different drug classes where the price increases had been more than 50% in the last 5 years, or more than 15% in the last 12 months. And then the manufacturers of those drugs have to report to the regulators why there were those price increases. And the regulator would share that information with the Attorney General, with the public, and with the legislature. In California, there was a ballot initiative that would have required state programs to pay no more for drugs than the Department of Veterans Affairs does, because they get the lowest price. And in Ohio, there's a similar ballot initiative pending and looking to qualify for the ballot next year. Engagement by stakeholders on this issue has been intensifying over the past year and a half. The pharmaceutical industry spent more than $100 million to defeat that California ballot initiative. The American Medical Association has launched a website called truthinrx.org. In the Wall Street Journal, a consumer rights advocacy group, Public Citizen, came out and criticized patient advocacy groups for accepting pharmaceutical industry funding, calling it a conflict of interest. And the National Academy of State Policy has laid out a series of tactics that states can take in order to address the issue, which include things like reimportation, protecting consumers from misleading marketing, providing Medicaid with more flexibility as a purchaser, and a cost review board. So in 2017, we expect to see this activity continue, increase, and intensify on this issue. And John, I'll turn it over to you.
Okay, good afternoon, and I'm from Washington. There are 2 groups of people who were celebrating this last week. One, my realtor friends who seen every 4th house in my neighborhood go up for sale. And secondly, my pharmaceutical friends who thought they won a big victory. And I'm here to say they shouldn't celebrate because I do think that the issue of pharmaceutical prices is going to be addressed in the next Congress. might be addressed a little differently, but nonetheless, it's too big. It's too big politically, it's too big as part of the federal budget, and talking to members of Congress, they want to do something on both sides of the aisle. Not clear yet exactly what, but that will come. So I represent a big coalition. We've mounted something called the Campaign for Sustainable RX Pricing. It includes all of the major healthcare stakeholder groups, with the exception of pharmaceuticals. So we have health plans, we have hospitals, doctors, consumer groups, just about everybody else that is concerned with the issue, united around the effort to move forward with some market-based solutions. We're not talking here about government price setting. We're not talking here about solving our problems by buying drugs from other countries and importing them. We're talking about how do we get a system that works on a sustainable basis in the U.S. Now, we've already gone through some of the issues around prices. Let me just say that the phenomenon of big price increases is not limited to just those that have been in the headlines, but it's widespread. And the industry has become too dependent on the model of launching prices and then raising them twice a year on a compounded basis for as long as they can. And that's just not going to work going forward. So we do have a little bit of a dynamic going on in terms of innovation. This chart tries to show how much of the increase in cost year to year is due to generics on the top. The next bar down is new brand drugs. And then there's price increases for existing branded drugs. And then there's volume, and then patient expirations are a cost saver. And you can see that there's a pretty substantial increase year to year, half of which is due to increase in prices on existing branded drugs. So, what I want to focus on in a few minutes here is what can we do about this? And as I said, we favor market-based solutions and 3 buckets of changes. There's no silver bullet. This is a complex industry, complex problem, and we're going to need a range of different ideas. So the first idea, has already been mentioned, is transparency. This is an industry that it's very difficult to find out what the actual price of the drug is. It's impossible to find out what the basis of the asking price is. And we need a more transparent approach. We need to know why prices are set the way they are. We need to know comparative effectiveness, the cost of R&D versus the cost of marketing. There's a lot that would actually help a constructive dialogue if this information were in the public sector. And so I do think that we will probably take that first step towards transparency as a way to make other steps more likely. One of the biggest problems in our current opaque system is rebates. And a friend of mine, Scott Gottlieb at AEI, has suggested that we should outlaw rebates and go back to a system where we have above the board discounts and therefore a more transparent market. An interesting idea. Now, secondly, once we have transparency, we need to promote greater competition. That involves some changes at FDA. getting drugs to market faster, not just the first-in-class, but the second and third-in-class drugs. It means that we need to have post-market surveillance and reporting of how certain drugs do versus other drugs. Again, comparative effectiveness. We think we should have extended exclusivity only for those most innovative products, not the ones that are just slight change with no real improvement in patient outcomes. And of course, we need to catch up to the rest of the world in terms of biosimilars. And we could also think about, why do we allow so much spending on direct-to-consumer marketing here, unlike almost every other country in the Western world, when that clearly contributes not only to confusion, but to overall excessive cost. I note that the AMA and the internists have all called for banning direct-to-consumer ads. Our coalition does not support banning, but we certainly think that we could limit the amount of money spent on direct-to-consumer advertising as a way to reduce the overhead for prescription drugs. Finally, we need to move, as we are moving the rest of the healthcare system, toward paying for value, toward paying for what works. And we're far away from that today, but we're seeing some interesting proposals, a very targeted nature. This is not going to be easy, but the idea is to condition the payment for a drug to its effectiveness. And recognizing that some drugs work for some people, not for all. Recognizing that this is a high-risk industry and that we need to preserve incentives for innovation. But nonetheless, we should be promoting and encouraging the development of drugs that work to actually improve patient outcomes as opposed to improving a bottom line on a profit and loss statement. So one tricky part of this, however, is that the part of value must include affordability. What good does it do to have a drug that actually helps people if we can't afford it? And I'm talking about the system as well as the individual. We already have a case in the Hep C drugs where our system can't afford to pay that much for over 3 million people who have Hep C. About perhaps one half of the prisoner population has Hep C, and the prisons can't afford it without bankrupting our prison system. State governments can't afford it without taking money away from schools or public health initiatives. Certainly plans can't afford it, and families can't afford it. So it's an important part of value is affordability and the broader context of where we ought to be investing in healthcare to get the best outcomes. We can't just look at drugs by themselves, but we need to look more broadly at how to improve well-being, how to improve outcomes, and where we need the investment. It's tough work. This is not going to be easy. Not going to be easy politically, not going to be easy analytically. But we can start by agreeing that the current system is unsustainable. We can start by agreeing that we need more transparency, we need to promote competition, and we need to pay for what works in the context of affordable health care. So with that, I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Well, thank you, John and Mara, for setting the stage quite nicely in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the cost of pharmaceutical products in the market and the high cost there. What I want to do now is share with you from a perspective of a health plan, and how we look at pharmaceuticals, the cost of pharmaceuticals, and making decisions regarding coverage and utilization of those products, actually across both the medical as well as the pharmacy benefit, because what we're talking about here does not only impact the pharmacy benefit, it also impacts those pharmaceutical drugs that are utilized by physicians to administer in a physician's office or an outpatient facility. So we need to make decisions and have programs in place for all of those. And I speak from an integrated health plan perspective. Cigna manages our own pharmacy benefit. We are a PBM, and obviously we have our own health plan coverage along with other coverage offerings too, including disability. I'm going to speak from a perspective of commercial coverage only. I'm not going to be speaking to what we do on the Medicare Part D side. So we're talking right now commercial only. In terms of how we look at the cost of drugs and the influencers that are impacting cost of drugs and impacting decisions in terms of, you know, what we have to manage those drugs, we look at the landscape actually in 4 different buckets. We look at it from expedited drugs. So these are products that come to the market in a fast-paced fashion, maybe with less of a review than we see with other traditional products. They come through via the orphan drug mechanism or the accelerated approval process or priority review. And we do know that these products come out at about 10 times the cost of drugs that come through the standard drug review process. And in terms of managing these expedited products that typically come out with a very narrow indication, one of the things that Cigna does is really focus on coverage policy and positioning of the products from a coverage policy perspective. So we make sure that we have tight control and tight utilization management to assure that the drugs are being utilized only for the on-labeled indications when they come to market so quickly, and that we try to minimize off-label utilization of these products. I'll give you one quick example. Just in May, a product came out called Opdycke. It's used for a very rare condition called primary biliary cirrhosis. It affects about 130,000 people or so in the United States. Often ends up in liver failure and potentially the need for liver transplant. This product, not approved for an off-label use set though, is also being studied for NASH, or also known as non-alcoholic steatohepatitis or fatty liver disease. And fatty liver disease is extraordinarily common. It's probably one of the least recognized conditions. It's growing, and it's often in individuals who have hypertension, diabetes, and are obese and have hypercholesterolemia. And you're looking at probably about 30 to 40% of the US population. Opdycke is approved only for primary biliary cirrhosis, costs about $60,000 per year. And there's many other therapies that are appropriate for preventing obesity, high lipid cholesterols, and diabetes. We prefer not to see that product utilized for those conditions. Egregious pricing, we've already had quite a bit of a presentation point on the high cost of products, so I'm not going to speak to that there. Targeted drugs with debatable value. So there's 2 organizations. The ICER is also known as the Institute for Clinical and Economic Research, and then ASCO, the American Society of Clinical Oncologists, have taken a concerted, very academic approach to evaluating the price points of products when they hit the market to see if the price points actually reflect the true value that the products are bringing in terms of quality adjusted life years saved. And we're tracking that information closely and paying close attention to that information as we make decisions for products on our drug list, and also as we make decisions regarding whether or not we want to move forward with an outcomes-based contract with the drug manufacturer. And then the next item is plan designs being compromised. So one of the big things here is that pharmaceutical manufacturers are recognizing that health plans are making decisions to put high-cost products on the highest tier of the drug benefit to try to minimize utilization, encourage lower cost utilization. Well, they're working around that by using couponing programs, which takes away the cost impact for the customer, because in most cases, their cost share then would be waived by use of these couponing programs. And that works in direct contrast to the efforts that we're trying to work towards managing in these products, because then the customer has access to the drug through the co-payment coupon, and the plan as a whole, the employer groups still get hit with the high cost of the drug. So those are some of the other factors that we're looking at. So what is Cigna doing in terms of trying to manage these costs? Is we're looking at it from a perspective of really trying to foster competition from drug manufacturers to have placement of their product on our formulary, and also push them to back their product with outcomes-based contracts. In addition, we recognize that we as a health plan have a very strong connection with the prescriber, and that's the initial point of decision in terms of which product is going to be utilized. And so we're using our relationships with our prescribers, primarily our large primary care groups, to drive influence in the pharmaceutical area in terms of pushing from volume to value, and trying to work with them to influence their decision when they make drug selection decisions. So let's talk a little bit about, in terms of on the pharmacy benefit side, what we're doing to manage drug costs. So intensive formulary management near term. In 2016, we made some very significant changes to our drug list. 2017, depending on which drug list, we are anticipating removing 40 products from one set of the drug list and up to 80 products from another set. There's no need to have a multi-source brand on a formulary when there are generics available. We also have a policy when a new product hits the market, there's a 6-month waiting period or 180-day waiting period in which the product is not placed on formulary, and customers still have access to that product through a medical decision or medical necessity review process. So we try to manage it that way. And then I also discussed briefly their outcomes-based contracts with drug manufacturers. So right now we have 5 therapeutic classes in which we have outcomes-based contracts with drug companies. Those include hepatitis C, which we discussed, diabetes mellitus, multiple sclerosis, heart failure, and then most recently hypercholesterolemia with the PCSK9 products. And so if those products do not provide the real world value that we expect to see from them based on the clinical trials that the manufacturer used to get FDA approved, then we seek deeper product discounts from the manufacturers. And these contracts are up and in place. The next area that we're working on is biosimilars, and we do need more competition in the biosimilar space. Unfortunately, there's a lot of lawsuits by the reference products to prevent biosimilars coming to market. Right now, we have one true biosimilar in the market, Zarzio, and unfortunately not, which is a biosimilar to Neupogen to increase white blood cell counts. We don't have enough competition in the individual therapeutic categories right now to drive the depth of discounts that we see in the traditional brand versus generic market. Right now we can only expect to see about a 15% reduction in the cost of the biosimilar compared to the reference product. And then in the long term, depending on how the new administration goes in 2017 and beyond, we might see more additional changes in terms of some policy changes at the federal level. So I want to speak very briefly in the few minutes I have left regarding what we're doing with our relationships with our medical providers, with our healthcare providers, primarily as it relates to our large physician practice groups. We have over 160 physician groups that are in what we call our Cigna accountable care arrangements, similar to an ACO or accountable care organization. And in these particular arrangements, our providers are incentivized via shared saving programs to reduce the total cost of healthcare. And that includes both the medical side as well as pharmaceutical products administered in their office. And they're incentivized to reduce costs as well as to improve quality of customer care. If they reduce costs only and quality decreases, then they don't qualify for shared savings. And we have 17 quality metrics that we use to manage or to track the quality performance of these providers. And of those 17, 7 are directly related to pharmacy benefits, and 2 are highly influenced by pharmacy benefits. So we highly encourage our providers to pay close attention to how they use pharmaceutical products in these arrangements. And one of the metrics that they have is a generic dispensing rate in their quality metrics component. And then we also are sharing information with our medical providers regarding individual customer level opportunities for lower cost alternative products. On the medical benefit side, we have a program in place that is looking at site of care administration. We all know it costs a lot more to administer products in an outpatient hospital facility. So now for a subset of pharmaceutical products, when the initial authorization request comes in, so a prior authorization or a pre-certification, we look at the product both from an appropriateness of use perspective for that particular customer's indication, as well as the appropriateness of the site of care for administration. And we give approval both for the product as well as for the site of care, with the goal to try to minimize utilization in a high-cost outpatient facility. So at the end of the day, what we're really driving towards is trying to make sure that we continue to have access to affordable and proven care as it relates to pharmaceuticals. Because if the prices continue on the way upwards as they are, if we don't manage the cost of these products, then it's going to be very difficult to continue to provide affordable, high quality care to the customers. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate the 3 presentations. Now, the questions asked by the moderator do not necessarily reflect the views of the moderator, but are for the purpose of stirring the pot. So keeping that in mind, based on your discussions, should we nationalize the pharmaceutical industry and just simply have the government take it over? I mean, really, we have a lot of discussion here about, I can remember arguing about PBMs before the legislature and how they are evil and how they are, black boxes which no one can peek into, and based on that alone that they're bad. And it seems like the same is thought of some of the drug companies in terms of disclosure of R&D costs, eliminating the ability to advertise directly to consumers, or limiting the tax deductibility, which obviously would have the same desired impact, or outlawing advertising, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So why don't we just have Donald J. take it all over?
Well, I think the pharmaceutical industry has actually been very successful, not just financially, but in terms of developing products that we need. And we want them to continue that success, but at a reasonable cost. So I don't think there's a strong case for nationalization. I think there's a strong case for changing the rules so that the industry behaves in a more sustainable way. Nationalization would involve a lot of very difficult choices about where to invest money and how much risk to take that really are better dealt with in the private sector.
Okay, well, obviously that's a given, but at the same time, some of your proposals are very strict in terms of if they were applied to a PBM, for instance, or applied to an insurance company. I mean, obviously, advertising is a cost borne by premium payers to insurance companies, and then by the insurance companies. Should we look to limiting the advertising for insurance products?
Is this on? Well, the PBMs work with health plans in order to get affordable coverage for those prescriptions.
They also work with employers. I mean,
patients.
employers hire PBMs.
Yes.
The state of Texas
Yes.
hires PBMs, and people criticize them because they say they're a black box that you can't look into.
That's a contracting relationship between the PBM and the health plan. The issue really
Would the
is
same
born.
apply to pharmaceuticals and in the insurance industry?
The issue, thank you for stirring the pot. The issue is really born at the beginning of the price setting process with the pharmaceutical company that puts the first price on that drug. And that's why we've been asking for greater transparency and understanding why costs are being set at the outset there, because that's the starting point.
So you
Everything else follows
information
from
alone will
there.
reduce the cost of drugs?
Transparency alone.
Transparency alone will reduce the cost of
It's
drugs?
the starting point for understanding the dynamics and allowing the parties in the private sector to have a conversation to try to solve the issue.
Cigna's wanting to comment.
Okay, thanks.
I'm sorry.
So one of the things that I mentioned in the presentation was the two organizations, ICER and ASCO, which are looking at, as new products come to the market, what is the reality of the price point that the drug company has set for that product? And does it truly reflect the value that it brings to the market, the price point, the value that it brings to the market in terms of quality adjusted lives saved? And so both ICER and ASCO have started to have that public conversation about how realistic is the price point that the pharmaceutical manufacturer is putting out there as the initial launch price. And that's as they continue to work and get more products going through this evaluation process, that's going to continue to put pressure on the pharmaceutical manufacturers to reconsider the price points. Case in point, Mylan, they made a fairly quick turn in terms of their price point for their product with deeper discounts, and now they will have a branded generic, same drugs, different color package, but same drug company at half the price point. There was a lot of pressure very quickly on that organization, and they folded, they reduced the price. And the other drug companies are paying attention. And
So, isn't a large part of the problem the doctors who are prescribing all these things? And what should, if anything, should be done about that?
so that's, in terms of doctors prescribing the higher cost products, that's part of what we all need to do, is to continue this conversation about the cost of pharmaceuticals, so they will have that information at hand and
But
understand.
I mean, the cost of the
when they
pharmaceuticals is
prescribe.
known. The price is known. It's not a secret what the
But-
price is.
You ask most primary care physicians, when they prescribe a product, they do not know
Well,
the
they
cost
should,
of the
shouldn't they?
product
So isn't that part of the problem?
unless it is in the press.
There was actually a proposal in Louisiana this year that would have required by law in the state for pharmaceutical representatives going into physicians' offices to provide transparency, to disclose information about the actual prices of the medications.
But shouldn't it be the doctor's job to know that and to understand the efficacy of the drugs?
One of the proposals that I think will advance in the current new political climate is more capitated plans, both in the private sector and Medicare, bundling. And I think what that means is that doctors and hospitals are competing for the premium dollar against pharma. And if they want to prescribe high-priced drugs, that means there's less left for them. So I think it's going to change the awareness.
I'm sorry, what is going to change the awareness?
If you have a set amount of money,
Right.
out of
Well,
which
by capitating pharmaceutical costs?
capitate total costs,
Okay.
and then you have to fight it out, which goes to hospitals, which goes to doctors, which goes to pharma, then it becomes very evident what the trade-offs
Listen,
are.
I've got 7 more. I don't have time to just do one more. Okay, all right, then I've been told this is it. This is the last question. Should Americans be allowed to buy pharmaceuticals from Canada and other foreign lands?
You have to understand that I live in Michigan, and right over the river is Canada. And it's very common in Michigan for many senior citizens to take a day trip once a month or once every 3 months to go over there and get their branded medications, because
But does Cigna participate in the...
no, we
they
do not. We do not advocate for
Okay, well,
that at
that's
all.
my point.
And I don't advocate it for it either. We need to have close tabs in terms of chain of custody and understand where the products are coming from. There's too many products out there that are not truly what they are purported to be when you purchase them through the internet. So I'm not an advocate of that.
Cigna's a no?
Cigna's a no.
Okay. Contestant number 2?
So I think that what's interesting here is both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton proposed some loosening of regulations regarding importing drugs from other countries. And actually it was a major part of Trump's healthcare proposal. I think what's real, as opposed to what's rhetoric, is in limited circumstances where there's insufficient competition or insufficient supply, then I think you could imagine importing from other advanced countries.
And a bureaucrat in Washington would make that determination?
You know, it's interesting. Someone has to make that determination. And whether it's a politician or a bureaucrat, but someone needs to.
And AHIP gets the final say, the final words of this historic panel. Go ahead.
Well, we understand that reimportation is one of the options that state policymakers will be looking at. And we do hear reports that half the country might be moving to Canada right now. So,
Yeah, but the real question is, will your industry support that potential habit of going north or south or east or west for pharmaceuticals?
let's see if we can have the prices go down.
All right, let's give a round of applause for our panelists.